So this evening's talk is about the evidence for slavery and the connections to slavery in the archives at Herefordshire Archives. And so I'm going to touch on the generalities of this very cruel history that we all are familiar with, but it's not going to be a detailed talk about the details of the process, the ships to Bristol or Liverpool or whatever. It's very much about the evidence as it touches our own collection. And I think what's interesting about that is that just the random survivals that we have paint a very wide picture of the brutality of the whole system. And I think even these examples, these rare survivals, I think can be used as exemplars of a terrible story. And obviously, the last 5 years or so, there's been an increased emphasis really on connections to the slave trade and the whole terrible business of slavery. And there's been a kind of almost a revival of this and a sense of the need for reparation or acknowledgement. And tonight's talk really is not about pointing the finger and drawing associations and guilty connections. It's really about the evidence that we have, and also, perhaps almost shockingly, to see how widespread the links were and how ordinary and acceptable the whole process was. And the first connection really is a local one. I have to say, we have no archives relating specifically to Bannister Tarleton, who is your local link, and who has, retrospectively, I know, quite a damaged reputation for somebody who was brutal and whose family made money from the slave trade. And you can see the way in which he was viewed just by this entry in the parish register for Lentwood-Dine. So you see him described as Sir Bannister Tarleton, Baronet, Knight, Grand Cross of the most noble order of the Bath and General in the Army, etc., etc. So as everybody else just has a brief, curt reference. So he was a source of great pride to be linked to the local community. So the parish was very proud. And I think this is something that you can apply to all the families and the connections that we will look at this evening, because it's only latterly that a shadow has been cast over their reputation. And it's worth remembering that they were not seen as being anything other than lofty and upstanding members of the community. So it's important, I think, to look at it in the context of the times. So very generally, and a quick overview of a story I know you're probably more than familiar with, very simple description of the slave trade. So by the 1650s, there was a well-established triangular pattern of trade involving Britain, Spain, Portugal, France, Holland, Denmark, involving the developing countries in the Americas in particular. So trade goods from Europe were exchanged for captive men and women in West Africa, and then they were in turn transferred across the Atlantic on the notorious Middle to the West Indies and to Americas. And then the third part was the transfer of goods and chattels across to Britain and Europe, and sometimes the direct transfer of people as well. That completely glosses over the horrors involved in that, but consumer products and raw materials generally were transferred across in exchange. In the 15th century, the Portuguese captured slaves from West Africa to work in Madeira and also in Europe. And the trade expanded after the Europeans encountered America, and as slave trade and slave labour was seen as an important element in the expanding economy. The English were involved very heavily as a maritime nation, in the 1560s particularly. And this individual, John Hawkins, was one of the first to really capitalise and exploit this new opportunity. And his first voyage of 1562 consolidated the triangular trade route that I've mentioned earlier. And he violently captured 300 Africans from Sierra Leone. There were 4 voyages that he was involved in from 1564 to 1569. It took 1,200 Africans to sell to Spanish settlers in Hispaniola, which includes Haiti. And these were traded for fur and for sugar. And indeed, his coat of arms very explicitly includes an enslaved person as part of that. So you might wonder what the connection in Herefordshire is. And it's quite simply the Lady Hawkins School in Kington. So John Hawkins amassed a fortune from his pretty ill-gotten gains, and £800 of his inheritance passed on to his second wife, Margaret Vaughan of Hargest Court in Kington. You may know it, it's quite a forbidding but very impressive medieval house on the outskirts, probably haunted, was reputedly haunted. And she left in her will, in turn, money to found a school in Kington, and that's the establishment, the origin of the Lady Hawkins School, Lady Margaret's School. And her will, in the Prerogative Court of Canterbury, which you can access via Ancestry, free of charge, and the Prerogative Court of Canterbury was for well-to-do individuals who had property in a number of dioceses, and the diocese was the place where wills were proved. And you can see there are explicit references to Herefordshire in that. And you can see there, that's Dame Margaret Hawkins mentioned there. Sometimes these are quite difficult to decipher. So she's leaving £40 towards the perpetual maintenance of a chaste preaching divine to keep a free school in Kington. As well as that, money to the poor of Almley, that's £10, where she was nursed. So as a baby, she spent time in Almley. So already you can see the indirect connections, how far you can identify this as money directly from the slave trade or from slavery, impossible to tell. But the chances are somewhere in the mix was money derived from this source. And so already, even as early as the 16th century, early 17th century, it's beginning to percolate its way into the bones of society. We have the establishment document in the archives for the school. And that's her name, Hawkins, up there. And the document reads, whereas I, Anthony Lewis, executor of Dame Margaret Hawkins, deceased according to her last will and testament, have at Our Lady Day 1622 purchased lands of the early value of £40 for the perpetual maintenance of a schoolmaster and usher within the parish of Kington. So it's remarkable survival, this one-page document. And again, with that indirect connection. But there's evidence, more suggested evidence that the wealth that she inherited from from John Hawkins originated on the Spanish Main, shall we say, and with that you can link to. And so, back to her will, it describes 11 pieces set with 65 pearls, having a tortoise pendant set with a blue sapphire, 2 carosets of gold weighing 2 ounces and a half, containing 23 pieces set with pearls with a jewel pendant of 5 diamonds. It goes on and on and on. Mostly Spanish work. So you can only guess where that came from. So historians have estimated that between 11 and 12 million Africans were captured and taken across the Atlantic in pretty appalling conditions. Fewer than 9.6 million are said to have survived that crossing. And Britain dominated the trade between 1640 and 1807, when the slave trade was abolished by the British Empire, and then that was policed by the Royal Navy. Other nations, including the Portuguese and the French, continued to trade, and the last known slave ship was sent to Cuba in 1866, so still such a long period after the abolition. British ships during the course of the trade, transported some 3.1 million Africans, of whom 2.7 million arrived to colonies in the Caribbean and North America. And this is where our next connection comes in. Again, it's a fleeting one, but it tells a wider story, I think. You can extrapolate. We're looking at now Barbados. And Barbados was first occupied by the British in 1627, where they indulged in the production of sugar. And that expanded from the 1630s, and sugar became the most important trading commodity from the West Indies. And the move to intensive sugar production required large-scale labour and huge workforces. And it was concluded that the people who are most used to the punishing conditions, and we'll hear more about those conditions, were people from Africa. So they were suited. They knew it was calculated that their bodies would acclimatise to the terrible heat and the terrible privations. So from the 1630s, it is estimated that some 387,000 Africans were shipped to the island in terrible hardship. And our link continues. And this is a portrait we have. We actually have some portraits in the archives. They tended to come by default. So landed estates would say, you can only take the archives if you take the portrait. So we took these. So we have the papers of the Bridges family of Tiverton in the Golden Valley. And this is Marshal Bridges, who was Lord Lieutenant for Herefordshire. Sorry, High Sheriff, I beg your pardon, in 1672. Obviously, at the peak of the social pyramid. And remarkably, we have letters between Marshal and his brother William, who, like many second sons, was compelled to go and seek his fortune elsewhere because the inheritance all went to Marshal. This is not to excuse him, by the way. And we have letters from William to Marshal from Barbados. And this one is in March 1660, where he says, "Since my last unto you here hath arrived 2 or 3 London ships, but not a word from you nor any of my friends." So he's feeling a bit isolated out in Barbados. And I should say that the language that feature in the archives inevitably are contemporary words, which nowadays would be offensive, but I shall use them because they are from the documents. And so he's asking, please, send what I asked before: 6 shirts, 1 siding hat, 6 whole doublets, 2 pairs of silk breeches of new fashion, 6 pairs of tanned gloves, he's quite the man about town, 1 pound of wax, plus 1 morning gown made very handsome, 6 pairs of shoes of Mr. Simpson, as good as ever he made. This implies that Marshal traded in Barbados as well, because it says, if you please to trade any more in this country. There's a sense of bonanza, new opportunities to make a fortune, to make a killing. And then there's a PS. PS. If you and some other young man would fall into a Guinea trade and so bring Negroes hither, it would turn to a good accompt. My uncle, I know, would do much in it, and several others would be both for your profit and mine. Please to honour me with a consignment of a ship, or part of a ship of Negroes. And so this comes at the end as almost a postscript of this letter. And a further letter to his father later on. September 1660, he expresses polite concern for the well-being of his father. Are you all right, Dad? And then gets to the nub of it. I would desire you, if you can do me your favour and send me 40 shillings and pay it into my brother Marshal. I will pay you honestly the next year with interest. So obviously he's beginning to fall on hard times. And then clearly from the tenor of the following letters, you get the sense that he was to succumb to the terrible conditions in Barbados. And so the next letter is from a friend to Marshal. These are to acquaint you of the death of your brother, Mr. William Bridges, whose death I do as much lament as he had been my own brother. He was the best company I had in the island. So obviously they had a grand old time and exploited the sort of cargoes of misery as much as they possibly could. But he did not survive to tell the tale. And then another connection is this chap, with the gloriously named Ferdinando Gorges, whose manor was Eye Manor. This is where he lived. I think there's a former Conservative minister who lives there now. So he bought Eye Manor in 1673 for his retirement. And the source of his money, and the connection we have with him, is that he was very closely linked to the Coningsby family, particularly Thomas Coningsby of Hampton Court. And effectively, he was Thomas Coningsby's guardian, and he really fell into the care of Ferdinando Gorges. And his father, in turn, was essentially known as the father of colonization. So he signed the first Plymouth patent under which the Pilgrim Fathers crossed the Atlantic in 1620. And Ferdinando had gone abroad to work with Colonel William Hilliard, one of the earliest sugarcane planters in Barbados again. Married Hilliard's daughter with his own plantations and ships trading slaves and good, well-dried Muscovado sugar with the homeland. So from the fruits indirectly of this, this new house was acquired and gorgeously decorated with this wonderful stucco work, which I understand is still probably there. And we have evidence of his rather acrimonious relationship with, because Thomas Coningsby was a very difficult person, to say the least. Probably his upbringing had something to do with it. But they fell out in a big way, even though he'd married Ferdinando's daughter, Barbara. And so we have a letter to Speaker Foley from Stoke Edith that says, I do hereby beg you as friends to justice and lovers of virtue that you do not assist him, Thomas Coningsby, in his barbarous and wicked designs to the ruin of himself, a virtuous wife, and 4 lovely innocent children. Ferdinando Gorges. So that's the indirect connection, but definitely evidence, really, that could probably be traceable. And it's worth noting that Eye Manor was latterly the home of Jeremy Sandford, author of Cathy Come Home. So he was very much a social campaigner. Somewhat ironic that he would emerge from the same house as Ferdinando Gorges. And there's more evidence from Barbados. And this is from the Quarter Sessions records that we have, where there are minute books that describe court cases as far back as the 1660s. And there's a fleeting reference. And again, from this, you could probably extrapolate that this practice was widespread. Otherwise, it wouldn't be cited as evidence. So this is a complaint by Thomas Wythe of Webley on behalf of a son about John Seaborn of Cannon Pion, who is accused of having derived a trade in inveigling and carrying away poor children and selling them for slaves in Barbados. And this was at a time when you could potentially fall into slavery and you didn't have to be from Africa. Effectively, you could be persuaded to take a ticket or a passage to Barbados under an indentured servitude agreement. And so your labour you'd be exploited. And the idea would be that you would stay there as long as it took for your period of indenture to expire. Then you'd have a plot. But the likelihood is that you would die before the expiration of that indenture. So this is what is being talked about. So clearly, I think the fact that it appears suggests that this was a widespread, at least, in this case, it could be a mischievous accusation just to get somebody into trouble. But clearly, I think this did happen even on a sort of inland county, a landlocked county like Herefordshire. So another island, and this island is really the scene for the fullest and most direct connection to the business of slavery that we have. And this is in Grenada. And incidentally, this wonderful atlas is from the library collection. So even the atlas is actually from the archives. So we've been able to make use of this. So Grenada was originally had a population of about 1,400 Indians, Arawak Indians, and Caribs. It was the late Middle Ages. And between 1498, when Columbus sighted the island, and 1609, the first settlement by English, the population decreased dramatically. And you can see from this graph that the democratic changes really stepped up from the late 17th century. Quite a dramatic shift in population. By 1649, it had been colonized by French planters with African slaves. So this was the first introduction of enslaved people from West Africa. By 1651, the Caribs, who had been there, as well as the Arawaks, had been completely wiped out, exterminated. And that started a process of completely transforming the environment so that ultimately it was to become utterly changed and denuded of its indigenous people and landscape. There was a complete reduction in biodiversity, to use the current language. So between 1671, you can see when the numbers were a total of 505 and 1861, massive transition. And the gradual imbalance of free and enslaved people. Interestingly, you can see in 1861, the slaves had been deleted and that number had transferred across to the free, but it's only free to an extent because if you're a freed person who was originally an enslaved person, you're still stuck there and effectively an enslaved person. So that disguises the reality of post-slavery life in Grenada. In 1763, under the Treaty of Paris, Grenada was ceded to the British, and it kind of changed hands a few times. British investors purchased estates on the island as means of expanding property portfolios, really, and a way of making a lot of money. In 1776, the French retook it after the American Wars, and in 1783, under the Treaty of Versailles, British jurisdiction was reinstated. So it was very much a pawn in the geopolitical world. And there was a rapid expansion of the population, doubling again by 1772. The main crops were sugar, 32,000 acres, coffee, 13,000 acres, and cocoa, 700 acres. And these sugar required the greatest volume of enslaved people. And in 1763, the first indirect connection with Herefordshire emerged. There was a chap called George Amyand, who was a London-based banker, who sent his agent, Andrew Harvey, to Grenada to purchase property, a plantation, to add to his portfolio of investment. And Harvey purchased several estates from the parish of St. Patrick in the north of the island, up there. And this is a map from the estate collection that I'm going to come to, and this in particular. Among them was one called the Brienne estate from Monsieur Recruit Lataste, and many of the names are actually French because it was formerly a French possession. And the Lataste estate was leased back to Harvey, with Amyand becoming an absentee landlord back in the UK. And on Amyand's death in 1776, the estate passed to his son George, who married Catherine Cornwall of Moccas, and that's how the estate became part of the Moccas wider estate. And so, in the way of the times, he took her name in order for inheritance purposes. So he was known as Amyand Cornwall, but effectively it became part of the Cornwall possessions. And that is Sir George Cornwall's property up in the north east corner. George Amion Cornwall was a very respected member of the community, and in fact represented Herefordshire in the House of Commons from 1774 to 1807, when the abolition of the slave trade was enacted. So the Mockers Court archives are amazingly rich, and they just, it's a testament to the involvement in the plantation in Grenada. And there's never been any disguising. So although records to do with slavery have been emphasised fairly recently, they've always been available to be looked at in the archives. And the fact that there was never any attempt to remove before they were transferred suggests, that it was never seen really as a problem. So it's a wonderful set of evidence really for what happened in the past. And so this sketch plan of the relative positions of the different estates survives as a little piece of paper there. And so here we can see number 5 is the Latast estate down here. And that's the focus. Essentially, it's treated as an offshoot of the Mockers wider estate. And to illustrate how it would have functioned, I'm afraid I nicked from the internet, this image of William Clark's 10 views of the island of Jamaica. But this is how the plantation, the sugar plantation in Grenada, would have functioned. And so we also have detail of, and that again is that characteristic shape of the Latast plantation, beautifully illustrated, just to show the environmental degradation, because you imagine them as kind of rural entities, but actually they were industrial production sites, and it would have seemed like an industrial processing plant. So the original landscape, the plantations, the vegetation was cleared and replaced with sugar plantations here. And the whole lot was processed in this central zone at the bottom here. So there were 123 acres of canes, 40 acres of pastures, 31 acres of what are described as Negro gardens for the enslaved people, 8 acres of plantation walk, presumably the roads, and then 123 acres of wasteland and roads. And included in this plan a dwelling house, kitchen, works, stables, a windmill, a magass house, which is where the drying process of the canes took place, and a magass chute. So it was shot. They were shot down this chute. And so it's pretty well represented, and again, as I keep saying, an amazing survival. And represented, and this again is from the William Clark series. This time, it's a mill on a sugar plantation, I think in Antigua in 1823. The managers of the plantations enacted the British kind of mercantilist model of empire, with colonies producing goods for sale in Britain, becoming markets for the industrial products. And in the West Indies, the markets for clothing, food, and consumer goods were limited by the low or zero income of the slaves. So it didn't really work in the classic sense. It was just purely exploited, really. And the plan we've seen shows the distribution of land used across the estate, again with the emphasis on sugarcane. And it's a kind of stark image of systematic ecological degradation that would have had a lasting impact on the landscape. And the Latast collection includes detailed records of the management of the estate and capital items, including mills for crushing cane, with correspondence with suppliers in the United Kingdom. So, for instance, George Cornwall ordered a mill from Bolton and Paul in Birmingham, so a steam mill. So, top of the range engineering equipment were shipped out to start the process. And sugar and rum from Latast were shipped to London for sale. And of course, there were business risks, including the risk of unrest, which we will come to. And the returns survived to such an extent that they allow you to gauge the returns, which really varied from year to year, depending on crop yield and the market price for sugar and rum. So slaves were very much seen as chattel, and this is expressed no more clearly than in this document, and there are many versions of this, and this was dated 1807. And you can see how dehumanizing it is. So here we have in 1807, 79 males, 84 females, a total of 163 Negroes, plus 35 mules and 26 horned cattle. And there's an account of males and females dying since 1806. So the loss of labour is charted, quite shockingly in these, and more of the same. And so there's profit and loss. So on the one hand, you have loss through death, and this one, you have gain. So the population is regenerating itself. So Peggy delivered of a boy, and Patience, an elderly woman, died. So it's the balance sheet in a very bitter way, and more of the same. So that there are acquisitions as well as births and so forth. And again, there are numerous examples of this throughout the collection, but you get the sense, really. They were very much seen as chattel. But the whole process of looking at this, it's very difficult, but it's kind of nuanced as well, because in the middle of all this, there is an Act of Parliament that, and a local parliament, because there was a sort of local government in Grenada, which was effectively a quasi-legislature, which enacted its own legislation. And so there's an Act of 1788 for the better protection and promoting of increase in population of slaves. So, what's the motivation? Is it welfare or is it profit? And you can look at it in many different ways. By this time, by 1788, there was the beginnings of a movement in Great Britain. So it's possible that, opposed to the notion of slavery. And it's possible that some of these ideas would have started to soften the harsh approach that was exercised. And you can see it. So the fact that it appears in the legislation indicates that there was a need for things to be corrected. And so, for instance, the Act says that there were limits to the number of lashes that could be applied, 39. An excess of that, would result in a fine or prison. So, you were entitled to apply corporal punishment, but there were restrictions. How these were policed is another matter. 12 lashes was the limit for any one crime, and also fine or imprisonment as a consequence of failure to apply that rule, and other details like no work during the hours of night time. So enslaved people were entitled to rest. And also a small amount of property or of land to farm and to garden. So there were sort of attempts to, within the overall appalling atrocity that it was, to bring some regulation at least. And again, whether that was in order to prevent reduction in the population for the purposes of profit or for welfare is moot, but it's evidence and needs to be looked at in that way. And this is yet more evidence. This is an inventory of slaves in 1789, and occasionally there were separate snapshots of the population. So they're named. So they are personalised. You can make a real connection to these individuals, and then. Details about individual people, and also the skills that they had. So here we have a very infirm almost useless. So somebody who's 65 is almost beyond the age of helping and of labouring. And these are named individuals who are carpenters. So there's Sam, Dick, and Quagro, I think. So again, individual names, but no dignity of any kind of family names, completely attached to the proprietor of the plantation. So yeah, and these are documents you can certainly come and see in the archives. They're really quite revelatory. And here we are, a record of children as well. So these are children who are, are compelled to work as part of the general workforce. And so there wasn't a passive acceptance of this, and there were certainly revolts, and in particular, as far as Grenada is concerned, one called Revolt of Fedon, who was not an enslaved person. So coordinated resistance to the plantation regime were pretty rare because of the brutality that was involved in suppressing them. There were major revolts in Antigua in 1736 and Jamaica in 1789. And in Grenada, the tensions began to increase dramatically, particularly after the French Revolution, and ideas of liberty, equality were promoted by American and French revolutionists and revolutionaries, and they would be spreading to the Caribbean. And there was an uprising in the French colony of Saint-Domingue in 1791, led by an ex-slave called Toussaint Louverture, and that led to the sovereign state of Haiti in 1804. Between 1795 and 1796, Grenada in particular was rocked by a major revolt by this chap called Julien Fedon I mentioned. And he was actually a planter. He was a mixed heritage planter. And the governor, one Ninian Home, was taken hostage at the height of this. And there were pitched battles involving slaves who fought on either side of the rebellion. And about 7,000 militiamen were brought in to quell the eventual full scale of the revolt. There were executions, public executions of 100 white and free mixed heritage individuals. And so, although originally it was interpreted as an out-and-out slave revolt, subsequently it's been really seen as more of result of disaffection amongst residents of French extraction. So the enslaved people kind of would take sides on either side. So it wasn't necessarily straightforward response to the cruelties that were inflicted. But of course, it was always presented as one where the barbarism, the brutality of the enslaved people was against the white colonizers was emphasized. It wasn't necessarily a straight an accurate depiction of what happened. And the Lataste estate was very heavily affected by the disturbances, with property damage estimated at over £13,500. And again, there are very accurate and careful calculations in the estate records. And a letter which talks about that, and it talks about how it appears to have been planned and brought about by the intrigues and treachery of the French and adopted subjects. So the French and these pesky revolutionary ideas were given the blame. And the cost of reconstruction, and we've got details of that, there were £21,800 worth of damage. So a huge outlay. And it's these sort of kind of punishing costs that gradually and eventually would mount and give rise to the feeling that it wasn't worth the investment. So there were reactions to the sort of brutality and the iniquity of slavery and the slave trade. And that developed in Great Britain from the late 18th century. The 1787, the Society for Effecting the Abolition of the Slave Trade was formed and marked the start of decades of campaigning for legislation in the British Parliament. And the first objective was to end the trade in slaves. And abolitionists believe that if the supply of fresh slaves was stopped at source, conditions for those who were living in the islands would improve, and eventually the raison d'etre for the whole idea of slavery would be snuffed out. And published testimonies from formerly enslaved people like Olaudah Equiano, who published an interesting narrative of the life of Olaudah Equiano in 1789, was a big hit, and the reading classes picked up on this, and the idea that this was an appalling stain on Britain, the Empire, and on the Western powers grew and grew as from this early stage. And eventually the abolition of the slave trade took place in 1807. The abuse continued, and the plantation records show that owners like Cornwall were troubled by reduced stock. And so this is 1810. You can see the numbers, the balancing doesn't actually work. And in fact, there's a reduction, a net reduction here from 31 to 29 within the year of 1810. And that was a marker for the future direction of the plantation, simply because there was this limit to the fresh stock. And there's a letter here to Sir George Cornwall from his manager in 1817. It being so very essential to the prosperity of this state in the West Indies that the stock, more particularly of slaves, should be kept up, I cannot refrain from observing on your returns of the latter, not only how considerable a diminution of them there is, but to supply the losses in the 4 years from 1807 to 1810, it appears there have been 36 deaths and only 11 births, very much concerned with the financial aspect rather than necessarily the human loss. And then there's another letter in 1818. I'm truly sorry to state that shortly after the date of that letter, a most inveterate dysentery made its appearance among the Negroes at Latast and some neighbouring properties. It has proved fatal in a great many instances, and I regret to add that at Latast no less than 7 have died of it. They are Betsy, Matthew, each of 37, Goodfellow, a superannuate aged 87, John, a weakly mischief boy aged 6 years, and a puny infant boy in August, and Joseph, a leper. So they're all named, and there's a sense of kind of regret on a human level, but again, the bottom line is that of profit. This mortality is really distressing, but I trust it is now at an end and all the symptoms of the flux have disappeared for some time, and the gang, for the present, quite healthy. So the abolition of the slave trade in 1807 was a partial victory for the campaigners, and it continued through a series of campaigns like sugar boycotts and petitions. And in Herefordshire, the petition calling for the abolition of slavery worldwide was set up by the Anti-Slavery Society. And this is a reference to the petition in 1831. So in Herefordshire, the petitions were sent to Parliament from Kington, Withington and Hereford itself, and other communities, including the Birmingham Ladies' Society for the Relief of Negro Slaves was formed in 1825. So this is a notice of new Anti-Slavery Society meeting in 1831 in Hereford. And this is in the Hereford Journal, which is a great source for these sort of communications. The first declaration is that a state of personal slavery appears to this meeting to be repugnant to the spirit of the Christian religion, to the clearest dictates of justice, and to the genius of the British Constitution, and that to uphold slavery by taxation is as unjust as it is impolitic. And then there's a reference in 1831 to petitions again from Hereford. And a declaration that the noble Lord Earl Somers presented on Thursday to the House of Lords on this petition, which again demanded the end of slavery, and they were aware that a new initiative was being established, which was to bring about the end of slavery only through compensating the owners, and that was clearly very contentious even at the time. And so this letter actually demands that that the slaves themselves should be compensated, not the owners. And you may be aware of there's a wonderful website called The Legacies of British Slavery, which contains the records from the National Archives listing the numbers and the amounts given. So here we've got Sir George Cornwall Amyand, Grenada, and his compensation was £3,825. It is painful and vexatious disappointment of the hopes which we had been encouraged to entertain. It is impracticable and even confessedly absurd in its provisions, and it is entirely departs from the promise given to the parliamentary resolutions. We once more protest against the claim of the planters to compensation, but if government be resolved to grant them 20 millions of the public money to purchase emancipation, it ought to secure a more liberal return, which of course it didn't, because those who were emancipated were still pretty well tied to their plantations. I'm coming to an end now, so I shall rattle through the last bit, which is, again, the local impact and the local interest, because to highlight the fact that people in Herefordshire and across the country were not immune to the iniquities of slavery. They were increasingly aware. And there was a huge interest in the experience of slaves. And after 1834, with the abolition of slavery in the British colonies, there was, this was really brought to the fore. So this chap is Moses Roper, who also wrote about his experiences as an enslaved person, wrote a narrative of the adventures and escapes of Moses Roper from American slavery. And it ran to 10 editions from between 1836 and 1856. And he toured Britain, and it was a sensation. There was a huge interest in that, profound interest in Herefordshire. And this is where we have our own local connection, because this is in Ross-on-Wye, and it is the British and Foreign Society, where there was a meeting in 1839 where Moses Roper came and spoke to a crowd of no fewer than 500. And so talking about fire escape, I don't think there were many fire escapes in operation in 1839. Huge interest, and they talked about Mrs. Mills, etc. The meeting shortly since could be no fewer than 500 persons present, which was an enormous crowd. So I think the thing is that don't be too depressed by the brutality. There was real concern about the welfare of enslaved people and their stories and their circumstances. And a final detail is this chap, because again, history is about nuance and interpretation. And this is George Cornwall Lewis, whose statue you may be familiar with, stands outside Shire Hall in Hereford. And it's a statue that most people just walk past. They don't take a notice of. But he's married into the Cornwall family, so you could say that his reputation is sort of tainted. Nevertheless, he was born in Radnorshire, not far from here, and was MP for Herefordshire, became Secretary of State for War in 1862, and he spoke strongly in Cabinet against British involvement in the Civil War on the side of the Confederacy. And in fact, it was his voice really that prevented, I understand, Britain lending its weight to the Confederacy, and probably the history would have been different, because the Royal Navy would have come in, his fear was that Britain and the Empire would become involved in what he described as a race war. So he is owed a debt of gratitude, I think, and in fact, so much so, and you can tell the popularity of this chap. This is the unveiling of his statue in 1864. Wonderful photo, and you can see the community at large, including the bobbies. I think possibly a couple of nuns. There's the militia out in force. There's a lady there with her opera glasses, getting a good gander, and then there's the great and the good, including the mayor, who I think is speaking here, and here this person with slightly because it's 1864, he moved, and you couldn't really capture the detail, but that I only recently discovered is Lord Palmerston, who came to Hereford to pay tribute to his colleague, even though he was thwarted because Palmerston, by jingo, wanted to get stuck in, but Cornwall Lewis said, wiser heads prevailed. And in fact, Palmerston was himself dead the next year, so he was on the way out. So that's a final, I suppose, in the spirit of the rest of the talk, really. Some of the connections have been a little tenuous, but I think it just shows how much there was, the web extended into society. And it's not to judge them, it's just to understand that it did play a significant part even in Herefordshire. And Herefordshire is no different to any other county. If you go to any other archive, other record office, you'll probably find similar records. But I think we are particularly fortunate in those, particularly the Grenada Mockus records. That it's a real testament and evidence for us to look after for the future. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Rhys. I mean, you mentioned you did draw out the tenuous connections, but it was also a very helpful guide to slavery per se. So, a really interesting talk. So, thank you very much indeed. And can I ask you to show your appreciation again, please?